Good to be with you as we continue our series of devotionals in the book of 1 Samuel. In the closing chapters of this book, David continues to live life on the run from Saul, even though at the end of chapter 26, Saul says to David, remember, David has elected not to spear Saul in the middle of the night, having snuck up upon him. Saul says to David, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. But David has heard this before, and so he decides to continue his exile. And so chapter 27 begins, but David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. And so David hides in exile, excluding himself from the life of Israel, far from the temple, far from the worshipping community of the faithful. And with this comes all kinds of pressures and compromises. Now, to date, these devotionals have highlighted the way in which David serves as a type for the Lord Jesus. We understand the Messiah in advance of his arrival because we have the David narrative shaping our expectations. It bears the imprint of the Messiah so that we anticipate a certain likeness with David. But not for a moment should we read from Jesus back into David a perfection or a sanctity that's clearly not there in the text. David is also a very flawed human being long before his famous Bathsheba affair. Now, if anything, evangelical Christians such as me tend to lionize David a bit too much, to celebrate him as some kind of mini Jesus. I mention this because these closing chapters of 1 Samuel challenge any squeaky clean, simplistic views of David. Chapter 27 continues to tell the story of David's self-imposed exile from Saul. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maok, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favour in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag. So David and his people settle down and they make their home with the Philistines. But we notice in verse 1 that David thinks to himself about this decision to live among the Philistines. He doesn't inquire of the Lord, as he has previously. In fact, God is hardly mentioned at all throughout this narrative unit, which is kind of revealing. We remember also that David has previously tried to shelter among the Philistines with Achish, who in Psalm 34 was also known as Abimelech. That didn't go well back in chapter 21, with David needing to pretend to be insane in order to escape. So why try the same bad idea again? Well, most likely because David felt he had no other options. No country friendly to Saul, or even neutral, would dare welcome David and get offside with Saul and Israel. So David's only plan was to go into partnership with Saul's enemies, the Philistines. He needed to be a traitor, or at least appear to be. Now, such a plan seems full of risk and full of compromise. Let's see what happened. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. Achish, or Abimelech, gave David the town of Ziklag, probably because it was right near the Israel border, with the expectation that David and his 600 mercenaries would be raiding the 4 frontier towns of Israel. But instead of raiding Israel, the Geshurites, Girzites and Amalekites, they were actually the original inhabitants of Canaan that should have been defeated years before in the conquest of the land under Joshua. But in order to be given shelter by Achish, Abimelech, David has to deceive him into thinking his men are attacking Israel. Now, no justification is given for this raiding and pillaging. David seems simply to be a thug or a gangster. He's just killing and stealing for his own benefit and to feed the 600 and their families. The text is silent as to the morality of this action. Is David mopping up after Joshua, or is he just a mercenary? For David, this time of exile is filled with compromises and contradictions. But then, at the beginning of chapter 28, things get worse. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." It's likely that to accompany Achish would mean that they were to be his personal bodyguard rather than to be among the general troops on the battlefield. This would be a position of great trust and honour, the king's last line of defence. And if the battle was not going well for Achish, they would end up in the thick of the most dangerous hand-to-hand fighting on the battlefield. They would be expected to kill Israelites, as all real traitors would want to do. Now the tension is unbearable. David's life in exile means fighting against Israel, killing his own future subjects, perhaps even his own relatives. The lie is compounding. But on the other side of the battle lines, things are not going so well either. Verse 3. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. We need to know that a little later. Verse 4, the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." Now, as king of Israel, Saul was seeking guidance for the battle. Samuel's dead, so there's no prophetic help. The Urim was a priestly device used to divine God's will, but that seemed not to be working, perhaps because Saul had killed all the priests except for Abiathar, who had escaped the massacre and joined David. And so, Saul's plan is now to use a spirit medium to call up Samuel from the dead. Maybe in this way Saul could find divine guidance for the battle. Now, just as David's situation over on the other side of the battle lines was all wrong, Saul's resort to paganism is all wrong too. And to make matters worse, when called up from the dead, Samuel tells Saul that he and his sons will all be dead tomorrow, and that God will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. It's a cliffhanger of a plot line, right? How is it that even God's anointed king could come to this? Both David and Saul are compromised and trapped in circumstances of their own making, resulting, arguably, from their own lack of faith in God's protection. Although silent, God is not absent. He's bringing about his purposes both for Israel and for his anointed. Sometimes our situation in life can seem similarly hopeless, perhaps as a result of our own mistakes, perhaps through no fault of our own. We may very well be morally compromised. It might seem that we are trapped, but God is not absent. When God's anointed king went to the cross, God seemed absent for a time too, but his grace was unleashed in abundance. So no matter how dark our day may seem, we know that forgiveness has already been won for us by Jesus at the cross. We are not trapped by the Philistines, by our own lies, or by any other sin. As we turn to Him for forgiveness, we find ourselves standing confidently on the grace of God, assured of His love, no matter what our circumstances. Psalm 34 of David, when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away and left. I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt His name forever. I sought the Lord, and He answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. It is the same Lord who can deliver us from all our fears.